Bobby Torres of Frightbox recording here to show you how you can get a silky smooth cymbal sound by taking control over your high frequencies. Okay, so here's the thing. Many of us these days are using just a DAW and a simple interface, which is great. Interfaces are generally 100% transparent. Back in the day, in the analog days, we were using tape machines, mixing on an analog console, patching in outboard gear. All of these separate stages in the analog days would in general soften our high frequencies. These days with interfaces, there's no softening happening. What you put in is what you get out. That's what I mean by when I say that the interfaces are transparent. So the issue that we have is when it comes time to mix is in general, we'll have an extra buildup of high frequency content that we have to take care of. More specifically, instruments that have a lot of natural high frequency happening inherently within the instrument itself. And in this case, we are talking about cymbals. So I have a very specific and simple approach that I use when I have to handle my high frequencies within my cymbal tracks. And hopefully you'll find it useful when it comes time to mix your own productions. Okay, so without any further ado, I have an audio sample here. I'm gonna play it from the top, and then I'm gonna break down exactly how I'm achieving the silky smooth and well-balanced cymbal sound that you hear in the sample. Let's check it out. Okay, so in my opinion, that's a nice, silky, smooth cymbal sound. It's well balanced. You can hear everything nice and clear, but it's not taking your head off. The China's there, but it's not crazy bright. When he goes to the hi-hat, it's not super shrill and annoying. It's just nice and balanced. And the way that I achieve this is actually dead simple. So let's take a look at what's happening in the mix and my routing and everything else. Okay, so here are all of my drum tracks. So I have a kick snare, snare down, rack tom, floor tom, and here are my cymbal tracks. And this is my cymbal submix. So all of my cymbal tracks are being routed to my cymbal submix where I have some processing. So I have a little bit of processing on some of my cymbal tracks, and then I have the bulk of the processing happening on my actual cymbal submix. And then after my cymbal tracks, I have my room tracks. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna show you exactly how I achieve this sound and how I process all of my cymbal tracks and even my room tracks as well. Okay, so on each of my cymbal tracks here, you see this plugin that's called Lo-Fi. What this is a stock distortion plugin right within Pro Tools. Now this song was recorded through a basic interface. The interface was very old. It was just a consumer grade interface from around 2006. It was a PreSonus. So again, the sound was just super duper clean, too clean. And in order for me to create some harmonic excitement, I just add a little bit of saturation on each of my individual cymbal tracks. And in this case, I'm just using the stock Pro Tools Lo-Fi plugin, which just adds a little bit of harmonic content. So aside from saturation on each of these cymbal tracks, I also have a little bit of EQ on some of them. And then I have an EQ on my cymbal submix and a little bit of compression. That is all when it comes to my actual direct mics for my cymbals. After that, I have a room mic track, which is not being bussed to my cymbal submix, by the way. It's going directly to the drum stem. That also has a Lo-Fi plugin on it, just for some saturation and some compression and EQ. Okay, so what I'm gonna do right now is I'm gonna bypass all of my effects, and let's take a listen to what our cymbals sound like completely unprocessed. Okay, so to me, they sound both too bright and too boxy, and there's too much snare, too much drum kit happening in the actual cymbal tracks. So the first thing I like to do is just get rid of all of that unnecessary low frequency content by going directly on my cymbal submix and applying an EQ. So let's check out this EQ that I have here. I am not shy with the high pass filter at all. I'm rolling off everything below roughly 500 Hertz. I have a little bit of notching happening in the mid-range, like the upper mids, and also the lower mids. So on all of my cymbal tracks, again, all of my cymbal tracks here, from my overhead left, overhead right, China, ride, hats, they're all being bussed here. They are all being processed through this EQ. So I'm getting rid of all of that low frequency information and a little bit of mid-range as well. I'm not really messing too much with the high highs on my actual submix. So let's see what this EQ is doing to my overall cymbal sound. Let's check this out. Okay, so as you can tell, it's cleaning up a lot of the low end. It's getting rid of a lot of that extra snare that we don't necessarily need, and just a lot of the low frequency content in general. So it's just focusing the sound on only the cymbals, and it's also softening a little bit of the mid-range, which I like, because a lot of that higher mid you really don't need, because that's where the guitars live, the vocals live, and even a little bit of the attack of the snare as well. So I want to get rid of that in my cymbal mics. Okay, so after my EQ on my sub mix, I just like to add a little bit of compression. Now let's see how much compression is actually happening on my cymbal sub mix. Let's check it out. So pay close attention to the gain reduction meter. So the gain reduction meter is right around here. So let's check that out. So I'm not using a crazy ratio, it's pretty low, it's only about 2.5 to 1. And there's only about 3 dB at max of gain reduction, because in this section of the song, he's really slamming on the China, and there's only really 3 dB of compression. The reason why I don't like to over-compress my cymbals is that if I do over-compress my cymbal tracks, whether I'm compressing individually or on my submix, you end up over-exaggerating the hi-hat. Hi-hats are instant death for your mix. They're obnoxious, they're generally just way too loud, way too shrill, and they can actually really screw with the high frequency content of your mix in general. So I do not like to overcompress my cymbals, because I want my cymbals to poke through, to be dynamic, but I don't want that hi-hat coming up and ruining the rest of my mix. So by compressing nice and light, I'm taming the transients, but just not bringing up the stuff that I don't want. Okay, so that takes care of the actual processing on the submix, which I always do first. Now, I wouldn't call myself a huge fan of top-down mixing, but when it comes to cymbal, because your cymbal tracks were all recorded in the same room, generally with a similar microphone, they all should have a similar frequency response. So by EQing the submix first, you're gonna save yourself a lot of time before you get to messing with the individual tracks themselves. Okay, so what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna play back all of my cymbal tracks, and I'm going to one by one engage my saturation plugin on each track, just so you can hear how it slightly warms up the sound of my cymbals. Let's check it out. Just so you can hear, I'm gonna bypass them once more, and I'm gonna play it, and I'm gonna re-engage the saturation once more. Let's check it out. So as you can tell, it's not doing anything drastic to my cymbal sound, it's just warming it up slightly. It's kind of emulating what a tape machine or even an analog console will do to the sound. It's just slightly softening the top end by adding some harmonics to the sound. So again, when you're recording through an interface is generally 1000% transparent, so there's no actual inherent sound of the interface itself. So after I add my saturation, I like to carve out some space in the high frequencies for specific cymbals. Now here's the thing, I am a minimalist when it comes to recording. I do not like to use a million microphones for no reason. For example, with a guitar tone, one microphone in the right spot on a vintage 30 is all I need. I don't need 10 microphones on a guitar cab. I don't need 3 mics on a snare. I don't need 10 mics on a bass cab. That's just my personal preference. But there's one exception. When it comes to recording cymbals, I do like to spot mic my cymbals because it gives me extra flexibility in the mix. For example, if the drummer asks me, hey man, can you turn up my China? I can't hear it in the breakdown of the song. If I didn't mic my China, it's kind of hard to bring out. Same thing with the ride cymbal. Let's say there's a really cool ride pattern where the drummer's not really playing particularly hard in that section of the song. I like having my ride track available to me so I could boost and showcase that specific part that the drummer is playing. That's why, in my opinion, when it comes to metal, just a simple pair of overheads generally just doesn't cut it. Now here's the thing, when you use as many cymbal mics as I do, the top end can become very messy. So I combat this in 2 ways. The first way, so if you look here, my China, ride, and hats, whenever my drummer's not playing the China, I cut the audio out of the track. So all of the dead space on the China track is completely removed when the drummer is not playing his China cymbal. The same goes for the ride cymbal, and the same goes for the hi-hats. Again, the reason why I do this is all of that extra high frequency information and all the extra noise that's happening in the track when the drummer's not playing that particular cymbal just clouds up the rest of my drum sound, and getting rid of it just really helps clean up the cymbal sound in general. And I take the same approach when it comes to EQing my cymbals. So earlier, we already took care of all of the heavy lifting on our cymbal submixing with the high passing and controlling of the mid-range, but there's still an issue of too much high frequency buildup because we have a lot of cymbal mics happening at once in certain parts of the song. So here's my philosophy when it comes to EQing your cymbals. You only really need 2 tracks supplying the super duper crazy top end. So what I mean by that is, if you look here, I already have an overhead left, which is really just the drummer's right crash cymbal. I have an overhead right, which is my drummer's left crash cymbal. I have a China track, I have a ride track, and I have a hi-hat track. So the way that I approach it in this mix is I let the overhead left track live in the super duper high end. I don't remove any of the air from that track at all. I let it be as it is. The overhead right, if we look at my EQ, I roll off a little bit of the super duper top. The reason why is I want to make room for my hi-hat track on the right side of my stereo spectrum, because my overhead right is panned hard right and my overhead left is panned hard left. So if you follow so far, my overhead left is living in the crazy top end. My overhead right is not. A little bit of that top end is rolled off. Now remember, my overhead left is living in the top end, so when it comes to my China track, I'm rolling off a bunch of the super duper crazy top, I'm cutting a bunch of upper mids, and I'm cutting some lower mids as well. This is because these frequency ranges are already being eaten up by my overhead left track, okay? So if I were to just leave my China cymbal completely flat, there would be a buildup of these frequencies, and I don't want that. I need to make room for my overhead left track. And the reason why I've decided to pull these frequencies out of my China cymbal and not the overhead left track is because I'm editing out the dead space on my China track when he's not playing it. The overhead left track is not edited at all. It's left wide open throughout the duration of the entire song. Now, due to the nature of ride cymbals, they're just generally less obnoxious than China cymbals, so I decided to leave that track flat. I didn't need to pull out any of the super duper top again because ride cymbals are just generally more pingy and less splashy sounding, so I just didn't feel like it needed to have anything taken away from it. So again, on my overhead right, I'm removing some of the air so that way I have room for my hi-hat track. Now my hi-hat track, I'm leaving the top end intact, I'm just removing a little bit of the harshness in the upper mid range. Generally your hi-hat track is gonna be pretty harsh, and I found that most of the time there's always a buildup of upper mid range, so I'm just pulling a little bit out on the track itself, so I don't have to pull out an extra amount on my submix. The hi-hat just always has too much upper mids, more so than my other tracks most of the time. Okay, so I know this seems like a lot, but it's actually a very simple concept. Keep this in mind. There are only so many things you could have happening in that upper frequency range without it getting messy. I kind of think of it like this. The super duper sub, you can only have so much happening before it gets out of control, as we all know. And the same thing goes for the extreme top. You can only have so many things happening in that air range without it getting very messy sounding. So that takes care of all of our cymbals, but there's one more thing that we gotta remember. Our room tracks. The one thing room tracks always have too much of is just a bunch of cymbals. So here's how I handle my room tracks. So just like my cymbal tracks, I have a saturator plugin just to kind of warm up the sound. So I'm actually gonna play my room tracks back just so we can hear how the raw room tracks sound on their own. Let's check it out. Okay, so to me, I hear a little bit too much kick drum and I just hear a little bit too much cymbal happening. So the first thing I'm gonna wanna do is add some saturation. Let's hear what the saturator is doing to the room tracks. Let's check it out. Okay, so on the room tracks, it's way more subtle. To me, I barely even hear it affecting the cymbal. It's really just kind of softening the snare sound slightly and softening the kick sound ever so slightly. Again, it's very subtle. But that's not really the takeaway here on the room tracks. The big thing on the room tracks is the EQ that I apply. If you notice, I have a high pass filter and it's rolling off a bunch of the low end, and I have a low pass filter that's rolling off a bunch of the top end, and I have some notching in the upper mids. For some reason on this particular day, I guess this drum set that I was using, there was just a bunch of upper mids happening, so that's why I have some cutting happening in that range on multiple tracks. Okay, so let's hear how the EQ is affecting my room sounds. Let's check it out. So as you can tell, it's really helping my cymbal sound. It's getting rid of the cymbal because I don't want a bunch of splashiness happening in my room mics. I already have that sound coming from the direct mic. For me, the room mics are all about the shells. I want the bombasticness of the kit. I don't want a lot of kick drum and I don't want a lot of cymbal. I want more of the snare and the toms. That's just me. I find that it really helps fill out the sound of the kit and just add a nice realism to it. And in terms of compression, I don't really compress my room mic because I find that when I leave the room mics dynamic, it just adds a lot of nice warmth to the rest of my drum kit. Okay, so that's all my processing. So let's take a listen to all of the cymbals and rooms completely bone dry. Again, this is the cymbals and the rooms with no processing at all. They're both too fat and too trebly at the same time, in my opinion. And now let's add all the processing back in. Okay, the cymbals are way smoother. Everything has its own place. There's not a ridiculous buildup of low end like before, and all the top end is nice and carved out and smooth sounding. So before we go, let's listen to the cymbals in context. So in my opinion, that's a nice cymbal sound. It's nice, controlled, and smooth. And it did not take a bunch of fancy trickery, did not take crazy expensive plugin, did not take outboard gear, didn't even take using nice gear. This was recorded through a cheapo setup from 2006. So remember, it's all about the workflow, not the gear itself. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon in order to be notified every time I upload one of my weekly videos on all things metal and rock production. You can both like and follow me on Facebook and Instagram. Links are in the description below. And do not forget to download my free quick EQ guide that contains all my EQ settings that I always return to when I start a mix. There's a link below, right within this video's description. Till next time, happy mixing.